We're in business to save the planet, and we use making clothes to do that. The cure for depression is action. Every one of us has to step up and do what you can according to what your resources are.
All right, how's it going? That was the voice of Patagonia's Yvonne Chenard, and this is Type 2, a podcast from Looking Sideways, in association with Patagonia, that explores the intersection between outdoors, action sports, and activism. Episode 10, this one. And in each show, I've been meeting people who are using their passion and involvement with the cultures we all love to create change. I've been discussing the issues they're involved in, the change they're seeking to create, the difficulties involved, and the rewards that follow. Now, this week's guest has long been on the hit list. It's surfer and activist Dave Rastovich. Dave is one of the world's most respected, stylish and talented surfers, who's also had one of the most interesting careers in surfing. I think you can easily say that. He came up with peers like Joel Parkinson and Mick Fanning. Parko says he's the most talented surfer he's ever surfed with, in fact, but early on rejected the idea of a competitive surfing career and instead became the modern manifestation, really, of the free surfer, following in some venerable footsteps with that path. And he's always been an innovator and a leader, Dave. Always been ahead of the curve, whether it was through that career path, through the equipment that he championed when it was not fashionable to do so, and his environmental activism, because alongside his surfing, Dave has come to epitomise the very idea of the modern surfer as activist, initially thanks to films like The Cove and Minds in the Water, and then also through his involvement in various different campaigns. Today, Dave's living with his young family on a patch of land near Byron Bay, and a very idyllic life it sounds, as you're going to hear. And he's still a committed, articulate activist who's lent his heft to campaigns such as the Fight for the Bight, King Island. There's a long list. We go into a lot of them, as well as local issues that he's also very passionately involved in. Now, Dave Rastovich's story is pretty well told. So in this conversation, I was interested in seeing where he is now, in light of his experience as an activist, as a new dad, and also as a result of the very real ecological damage that they've been experiencing in Australia over the last couple of years. How's it changed his approach? What's he learned? And what lessons can we take from Dave's experiences? I'm sure it's not going to surprise anyone to learn that Dave is a lovely, generous and interested conversationalist. And I very much enjoyed this wide-ranging and passionate chat with one of surfing's greats. Just a little note on the sound. As is normal these days, we recorded this one over Skype actually this time. There is some background noise. I'm sure you'll cope because it's a great conversation. My thanks to Dave for being such a great sport. Here it is, me and Dave Rastovich. Enjoy. You got some waves this morning?
Yeah, we're on a run of about 2 months of surf here, at least, I think. When I say we, I mean like my partner Lauren and I and our little sort of neighborhood of surfing sort of people in this pretty rural area between busy surfing areas. But yeah, we've had a run of surf which is typical for autumn for us, and the last few years we have not really had any autumn season. And so we've just had these long, nasty summers that have then in June or July just switched to winter. And we've just missed our whole favorite, most celebrated surfing season of the year. So actually right now, you've got the human drama of all the virus stuff and everything, but that's way over there in left field, because right in front of us here in this region every day is pumping surf and empty beaches, and there's rain and there's sun, and so all of the food we grow is just powering, and there's fish everywhere and migrating whales, and it's just like, yeah, the human story's not really that interesting right now compared to all this other stuff.
That must have been quite a relief after the summer you guys have had as well, right?
Yeah, so coming out of really the last few years, though, we've had a very strange cycle with our seasons where, like, I live on 20 acres of land. I have across the road from where I am, there's monocultured sugarcane being farmed. They've just switched to macadamia, but it's still monoculture. And we've watched them struggling, and when they turn their soil, it just blows away into the air, like dust, you know, and then on our side of the road, it's all small acreages that are growing lots of diverse food and doing lots of different smaller scale type of family farming stuff. And we've all been struggling the last few years because it's just been so unpredictable and so dry and just very strange, very, very strange seasons. And so that's why this year to have what we would traditionally say a typical autumn where we've had plenty of rain, plenty of sun, and plenty of surf is just a huge relief after all the fires and everything that happened. So, you know, it's longer than just the summer that the world saw us go through. Has been, you know, definitely some weird ecological imbalances expressing themselves here in Australia for sure.
So locally to you then, as you've just described, what do you put that down to? That variation that you describe in that kind of, because clearly there's an ecological reason for that, and you're so close to it. I'm sure you've given it some thought. What do you think it's? What do you put it down to?
Well, you know, obviously there's the big, you know, human created impacts and on larger systems that are at play here. And you look at Australia and the deforestation that's gone on is outrageous, you know, and is still going on, especially in somewhere like Queensland, just radical amounts of trees being dropped every year. And so that affects rainfall, and then that affects, you know, where water is pooling or not pooling over this amazingly large continent. And so so really you can just see that it's sort of the repercussions of decades of industrialized practices on this country that are now coming back to bite us in the bum, you know. So like you go to the bottom of Australia, right? You've got this area like South Australia, the state is a very, very dry, very flat place that ends in these cliffs that plunge into the ocean. The ocean's full of life. It's incredible. And that's the bite. That's what we were all working for the last few years with fighting the bite campaign and everything. But when you drive through that landscape and you say or you feel that it's desert, it's only a type of desert because all the trees have been dropped so long ago, and it's just become massive monoculture, wheat belts and oat farms and soy farms and everything. It's only dry and like a desert because of that. So those are the sort of things that when you actually travel this country and you see these wide open spaces, and you don't just say, oh, wow, it's nice to be in an open space, but you actually look at the landscape and realize what's happened there, that you realize that sooner or later we're going to have to pay the price for those sort of actions. So anyway, that's how I see it here. And then when we think about just this area, you know, we've got a lot of issues with just river quality and water quality and stuff like that. So they're all things that entered the international sort of news space over the last 6 months, you know, especially when the country is burning. But they're all things that we've been living with here for a long time, if you have a sort of an interest in those things.
Yeah, I guess what you describe as well with that erosion is so maddening, isn't it? Because it's not like there aren't huge historical precedents for that. You know, obviously like the Dust Bowl, there are previous ecological crises. To call them well documented is to understate it, really. You know, it's a pattern that keeps happening, isn't it?
Yeah.
You know, like and people industry doesn't seem to learn.
Yeah,
I mean, the Dust Bowl is like probably the most famous ecological man-made disaster ever, isn't it? And it's exactly as you're describing.
Yep, exactly. Yeah. So the wild thing about what we have just endured in Australia with the fires is that it literally touched everyone everywhere. It was so radical. Like every summer there's fires in Australia. It's just the way it is. And some years it's in your area, some years it's in Tasmania or wherever it is, or these pockets. But literally over the period between September last year, which was when the first fires happened in our area around here and Angourie, the north coast of New South Wales, until the last fire, which was actually a friend of ours house on the last day before the rains came. Their house burnt down, which was in January. So we had this crazy many month long period where these fires really touched everyone, and it was really obvious through our sort of government and things like logging industries. Their response to that was so out of whack with the actual everyday Australians' experience of these fires, and the realization, no matter what background you have, if you're really conservative, if you're a really conservative farmer, or you're a really left field greenie, we're all united by the knowing now, the physical knowing, because we lived through it, that we are altering this space to a degree that's really harmful for all of us in the biosphere, not just for the wildlife or whatever. It's all of us, and so that's really quite interesting, because what will come from that perhaps is a really unified front of care and action and concern into the future that hasn't happened before in Australia. You know, there's always, like everywhere, there's factions that sort of oppose each other, and there's that sort of political battle that happens before you can get to, an agreement of some sort, or a realization that a place is better off left alone or saved in some way. But I think in Australia right now, there is underneath all of this current human drama of the virus thing, I think there is a real unity in our understanding that this place isn't as tough as we thought it was. It is fragile, and we do have a really big part in its well-being. So I think that's really exciting. That's a real positive to come from what we just went through.
It's really interesting to hear you say that, because obviously every country has that gap between, a government's plan for growth, which often is always extremely damaging to the environment. And if you look at Australia, that's particularly acute, because it's about mining, it's about going into remote areas, it's about, it's growth in Australia tends to mean damaging local environments, doesn't it?
Oh, 100%.
I mean, it just does, really.
Yeah. Digging
so
holes.
So you've got that gap between what government thinks is the right thing to do and then activism that you're talking about. And that's always been, from what I could see, huge in Australia. And also you mentioned the fires, and you could see that from Scott Morrison's, how badly he seemed to get that, like with his messaging. But Fight for the Bite's obviously a really positive outcome, because for once that gap was really narrowed, wasn't it? And it changed, like the activism that was there and the effort that you guys made actually did change that narrative. It meant that a decision that would have previously been taken economically, in which the government had backed 100%, let's not forget, it didn't happen. It changed. So I guess my question would be, you feel like that is something that could be more of a permanent movement then? You feel like that is changing? Yeah.
Well, I feel that also because of a local win that we had in our region a few years back against fracking industries that came to the area. In particular, a company called Metgasco came to the Northern Rivers region of New South Wales, which is basically in the hills behind Angourie, in the hills behind Ballina and Lennox Head and Byron Bay, in the hills behind the Gold Coast, even the south end of the Gold Coast, the river there, the Tweed River coming out at Snapper Rocks. This company was trying to get in and start fracking near the headwaters of all those amazing rivers, which come down to all these amazing waves. And at that event, what happened was the governance had signed, classic secret deals a few years earlier to give this industry access to land. And when the trucks started to appear out of nowhere and try and put these drills in the ground on these farms, farmers rang up their neighbours, started talking. They started talking to other friends in town, and then all of a sudden it just caught on that this really sort of unresearched and perhaps even then there was research to show how dangerous fracking was, but it was just a very new and sort of scary industry to try and insert itself into a really thriving agricultural area. And so all of a sudden there was a blockade, and it became this thing called the Bentley blockade. And you go online, you check out the Bentley blockade, you'll see how basically an entire region came together and formed a human blockade at this site to stop the trucks and to stop the machines getting into a location to break ground. And what we saw there that was so exciting was that we had even a few surfers out there. You know, this is like an hour inland, and it's really hard to get surfers to do anything like that. And so there was even a few of us out there, and there was real estate agents, doctors, lawyers, dairy farmers, hemp farmers, Indigenous communities well represented. There was everyone there shoulder to shoulder, and in the end it worked. And the government was going to send riot police in to break up the crowd, because the local police even were on side with the community and weren't going to do that. And so when it came time to it, and we all got word that the riot police were coming from Sydney to break up the blockade and let the industry in, I think it was somewhere over 2,000 plus people turned up on this fence line at this farm, and we're like, okay, sweet, bring it on, bring them on. That's like 50 people to each single riot cop. Let's see how far they go. And so because everyone turned up, the police never came, the permits were all pulled, there was an investigation, and the corruption was exposed, and it was a win. And it was this huge win for everyone to realize that because all of these previously opposed groups and demographics within culture here came together and started just sitting by the fire, or having a cup of tea, or having a beer, and actually talking and humanizing each other, and realizing that we all share these beautiful places with each other that have to be healthy if we're to be healthy, and all of a sudden it worked. And so I think that happening was really something that we were using when we were starting to do the rounds in Australia, talking about the threat of big oil coming into the Bight. Was that, hey, if we just get into these small communities where often surfers are also fishers, or are also working in the timber industry or whatever, and just make sure everyone's talking to each other, because these industries thrive on coming in and trying to divide up communities and make us squabble between each other in order for them to slip in and do their work. So the great thing about the Fight for the Bight process was that it was a really communicative sort of domino effect that started happening around the country. Everyone just started talking to each other, and it was perfect. When Equinor went to the Bight and started doing these like phony community meetings, where they would, talk to just a couple people in a closed room and then quickly scurry away. They wouldn't answer any proper questions or anything. Everyone got on the phone to each other and were like, you wouldn't believe the crap these people were telling me, and they just did this bullshit, and then they left. They all flew in on choppers, and of course, Australia being a pretty small population, it's like all of a sudden, Heathy's ringing up that person over there, and she's ringing up me, and I'm ringing this person, and everyone is up to speed. And so I think those sort of things are really starting to really empower people here in Australia, and also de-radicalize the whole protest activist idea. It's just like, you see all those paddle outs that happen around Australia, 60-odd thousand people participated in paddle outs around Australia on our National Day of Action, who were far from the areas that would have been affected by any kind of spill from that industry. And they were grandparents and children and teachers and lifesavers and surfers and ferals and everyone, So you can't, if you're in that industry, their typical response to protests is that they just say, oh, an extremist left field group over there with extremist views, and then all of a sudden you get pushed aside. But they can't say that anymore when you've got groups like around here. You got a group called the Knitting Nanas, and they're these grandmas who sit and knit in front of the council offices of these people.
That's amazing.
So it's great stuff like that, which is really cool, and I think it really plays into the kind of larrikin spirit in Australia when you have things like that happening, where you can make it a good time and make it more of a celebration about what we love and what we want to cherish and pass on to the next generation, rather than what we're protesting and saying no to, So I think that's a big change too in terms of activism these days.
Yeah, well, that's really positive, isn't it? Because, like you say, that divide and rule tactic is the number one in the playbook, isn't it? You know, to try and so if that's being circumvented because people are just bypassing it because it's more of a coalition of people, ordinary people, then that's obviously hugely positive. So because you've got a long history of activism, obviously, which is well documented. A lot of different issues around the world. Is this trend that you're describing recent? Is this a shift in the way that people are approaching activism? Is that something that you've noticed generally?
I reckon. Are you seeing that in England? Like I get the Resurgence and Ecologist magazine, which is from the UK, and that's a quarterly magazine that comes out there, which has a lot of updates on activism. It seemed like similar things were happening there. Is that your experience?
Yeah, I think so. I think like when you've got those, I think we lack the big win like you guys have had, though. I would say that there's great work being done. Don't get me wrong, but equally there are serious. We have a fracking issue over here, for example, and I don't really feel like we're winning those battles just yet. I feel like there's a bit more work to do on the kind of like the plastic issue. There's amazing work being done. That coalition is in place for sure, but I feel. I don't know what it's like in Australia. It's probably quite similar because you've got a Murdoch press as well, obviously. But over here, you so need to win that kind of Middle England. It's called conversation to change these things, and that takes a while. And what tends to happen over here is you'll get this like issue which is palatable to that middle ground. And plastic's a really good example because it's an easy one, isn't it? Or recycling, it's like, I can do that and salve my conscience, like I'm making a difference. But I feel like those bigger, I might be wrong, and I dare say people listening to this would think of some other examples. But yeah, I think Fight for the Bite, why it was so positive was because it was such a great example of that, wasn't it? It was such a huge opponent as well. I mean, let's not forget that. Like such a huge company, government backing, and to actually win with this coalition that you're talking about it's just a huge achievement, isn't it?
Yeah, well, another aspect of it, which I think is really worth mentioning, so that other people can be aware of perhaps some of the things that went into that whole campaign being successful, was it wasn't really owned by any one NGO either. It wasn't owned by a group. It wasn't a Greenpeace-led action that happened around the country. It wasn't any of those type of WWF big NGOs. It was really just a decentralized type of localized series of actions. And I think that's really cool because it makes you like a moving target that makes it so difficult for a company like Equinor to put out all the fires that we were starting. And so I think that's really great too. So, I don't have anything against the big NGOs. They've done a lot of great work over the years, and there was a great coalition down there, the Fight for the Bite Alliance and everything down south was doing lots of great work on the sort of bureaucratic levels and everything. But I really like the kind of guerrilla tactics of grassroots groups popping up everywhere and just mirroring the fact that all life on this beautiful planet thrives on diversity. So what we're doing with things like Fight for the Bite needs to mirror that, because what we're trying to balance out when we come up against a group like Equinor is a very monoculture of the mind type of approach to the world. They're just like, we're going to do this thing called drilling in a supposed vacuum in their mind where we can do anything in this area and it's not going to spill out and affect anyone else. Don't worry, fishing industry, you'll be fine. Don't worry, tourism, you'll be fine, And we know that that's not how this world operates. So I really like, just sort of thinking about and coming from those sort of places when I see a community-led, activism effort of some sort, it just feels like they always thrive when there's all kinds of people in the mix.
Yeah, no, it's a really good point, because like that kind of corporate cognitive dissonance, the idea that they just feel like they can, the Jedi mind trick. Yeah, there's nothing to see here. This is fine, but that is, again, it's a tactic, isn't it? And you can see this. I don't particularly want to make this yet another COVID conversation, but you can almost see this in the narrative, can't you? Like that's going on with COVID. It's like the way that governments are handling it. They're kind of using that same thing. It's like, no, we're doing a great job.
Yeah.
What's your problem? It's just a key tactic that they use, isn't it?
Yeah.
To try and stop activism in its tracks, really.
Yeah, I feel like they're all very militant style strategies and coming from a very militaristic worldview and approach. And so that's why for me, when it comes to things like activism, where we're working on these issues, I really don't like using the same language. Like when the whole bite thing started, I was really not stoked about the fight for the bite title, because
I can understand that.
As soon as you start entering into the fight mentality, generally that's because the conversation stopped. Like people start swinging their fists and punching each other and stuff and fighting because they can't talk to each other anymore. And so, and so just seeing that things like that Bentley blockade really succeeded because people started talking to each other. People who typically would fight each other down at the pub on a Friday night, if they saw each other, were actually chatting and talking and realizing their similarities more than their differences, and good things came from that. So it is something to be mindful of. I feel like when these sort of things pop up, and to try our best to step out of the whole us and them sort of dynamic.
I was reading, so we got a mutual friend, Sean, as well, and he did a profile of you. It's interesting that you say that, because I pulled this quote out. In the piece, he said he's a consensus activist. He'll try and bring everyone with him rather than pick sides, and that extends to the landscape as well. That's the quote from this piece that Sean did of you. And is that something you've learned through this experience, this long experience you've had of being involved in these different causes?
Yeah, so I think that comes from lots of little moments with people, and mostly from like seasoned activists over the years, and just listening to their stories of butting heads with people and it just not working. And so partly that, but then also actually going back to what I would say was my first sort of, I guess, creation when it comes to activism, where I conceptualized the whole idea of doing a paddle out in Japan at the Taiji Cove there, where the drives for cetaceans happen, and at a time where every Japanese surfer I knew had no idea about any of that stuff and that issue. And so I was trying to get that information about, how dangerous it was to consume cetacean meat because of the heavy metals and all the toxins in them. And I was trying to get out the information to the surfing and coastal communities there in Japan on that, and the inhumane nature of the drives, and the fact that they were nothing like the traditional drives that would happen there. It was very different practice now, and I tried, and that didn't work. And so then I came up with the idea of doing something perhaps more confrontational there, but still very peaceful, but just sort of getting in the way of those practices by getting in the water there. And it was actually the night before we were to paddle out into the cove, and I'd organised, something like 40 people to come there, and we tried to do it as covertly as possible, because we all had sort of targets on us, because I was affiliated with Sea Shepherd at the time. So, and in Japan, that we were considered terrorists and stuff. So we had to be very sort of covert, so that we could even get to that place in Taiji. But a word got to me the day before, that some local surfers wanted to meet and talk, and because they'd heard that I was coming to blow up all the boats in the harbour. And
wow.
And
right.
And when they heard that from the fishermen, that I was coming to do all this stuff, the surfers there were like, nah, that doesn't make sense. I don't think that Rastovich guy is that kind of guy. That just doesn't make sense. And so thankfully they managed to reach out to us through some friends, and we got to sit around late at night and have some sake and talk it out. And I got to tell them directly what it was that I was doing there, and gave them printouts of all this information, and just sort of pleaded with them to let us do this, because it was going to come to blows with all kinds of people there, and we avoided a big confrontation by just sitting down and having a chat, and just getting stuck into it and being really honest and straight up with each other in that way, and I'm so grateful to those locals who are up for doing that, and so grateful to the honourable nature of people in Japan who have a link to their ecology and a link to their traditions and their culture. And so I learned a lot from that. It was like we dodged a lot of bullets because we communicated. So that was a real teacher for me since then.
Because I guess the Sea Shepherd thing is like at the far end of the adversarial approach, isn't it? In terms of like being confrontational.
Yeah, it's confrontational, but it's an interesting one. That one, like Captain Paul Watson, the founder of Sea Shepherd, he references the fact that the Dalai Lama gave him this little statue of this one Buddhist deity called Hayagriva, and this statue represents like the wrath, the compassionate wrath of the Buddha, where if someone's doing something that's quite horrible and creating a lot of suffering, sometimes you got to shake them, give them a really wild shake to snap them out of that. And so he felt that by the Dalai Lama giving him this statue to put on the bridge of his ships whenever he was down in the Antarctic or wherever he was, or in the Faroes or all those sort of places, he had that in mind, and so that was a different approach. And sometimes I think when things escalate and perhaps you've been trying for so long to communicate with people and it's just not going to happen, then sometimes those sort of actions, like when the Bentley blockade happened, where people were chaining themselves to all these bizarre contraptions into the earth and like doing some pretty radical stuff to make sure no one was getting through with machinery, that's pretty intense, and then I guess a new incarnation of that sort of action was the paddle outs all around Australia for Fight for the Bite, where, you had like tens of thousands of everyday Australians going out and making some noise and forming that circle in the water and doing something that they had never done before and perhaps felt a bit vulnerable about, but doing it. And I think that's really great. So to me, again, like I'm just sort of reiterating my point before, but that just feels really uplifting for me. And that's, I guess, that feeling of bringing people along, and what Sean was talking about there is because of those sort of experiences.
So it sounds like there's been an evolution in your approach to this, really, over the years, which is, an obvious thing to say because you've been doing it a while and you've been involved with so many campaigns. You've referenced quite a few. There's another quote in that piece. Don't worry, I'm not going to keep reading quotes at you, which is from you, actually. It says, "For me now, integrating activism into daily life, being able to raise my family, regenerate the land I live on, stand up for what's happening in my local area is important." So, because, traditionally you have been involved with these big causes. You've, again, like I say, you've referenced a few. Has that shift to like a local thing that you describe in there a natural part of the evolution in how you approach these issues?
Yeah, I think like through my 20s and early 30s, so I just turned 40, so between my 20s and early 30s, I had the real travel surf adventure bug, and it's kind of one of those domino things where you meet someone on a trip and then they say, "Oh, I'm from this part of the world, do you want to come visit?" And so it's like, sure, I'll roll with that, and then all of a sudden you find yourself in South America or something, or whatever it is. And so that's just sort of how that happened. I never really seeked out causes or issues at all. It was mostly the fact that, the surfing culture is pretty small, and you generally, especially when you're surfing like waves of consequence, or you're going out of the way to really get to specific types of waves, you meet a pretty small group of people who know each other. So that's kind of how those things were happening at the time, where you'd meet Ramon Navarro, and then Ramon would tell us about issues in Chile that might need some help, or help a bit of amplification, and it's like, how do you say no to that? So all of a sudden, you're drinking, massive bottles of amazing red wine and having a great time, and trying to do your best to help out a mate there, or whatever it is.
Yeah.
So for me, it was always just like that. Like, actually, I've always been really happy to just sit on my bum at home and have a really simple daily life. But it was just that through having really just good fortune and being lucky to be, I guess, a young white male in the world who's sporty. I had lots of support to do these things. But eventually, I found myself on the piece of land that we're living on now, and with a partner who I would just I'd do anything for, and really, really wanted to have children with. And so those things have happened. And so there's I guess a natural sort of slowing down of the travel. And then the fact that, Australia over the last few years has really had an increase in, efforts to exploit the landscape and the seascape here. Like, there's just been radical stuff. Like, you got the Adani coal mine idea off the Barrier Reef. You've got expansion of fish farms in the bottom of the country where I have family living in Tasmania. You've got things like the oil industry in the Bight and the gas industry here in our region or off Sydney. There's just been a huge ramping up of extraction industry efforts here. So that's really brought it home too. It's just like, man, we got stuff to do here. And so that's just been a really sort of, I don't know, pretty mellow, easy transition in that way, where it's just a natural fit.
Yeah, it makes total sense. Like you say, like you change, don't you, personally, as what's important to you, and you, again, really obvious thing to say, but what's important to you when you're 20 is not what's important to you when you're 40. it's that simple, isn't it? You know? Especially when you bring family into it, and there's quite often a desire to ground yourself, isn't there? Once you get to a certain point, which it sounds like something that has certainly happened to you.
Well, I'm largely trying to undo the last 15 years of my life, because it was about as excessive and kind of hedonistic as it gets, just flying places to go surfing. If it was for 2 weeks or if it was for 2 months or whatever, you're still, flying somewhere on the other planet just to go ride waves. And where I live, there's waves out here every single day. So why the hell was I doing that for 15 years? It's a pretty gluttonous thing to do.
Well, it's hard to take yourself seriously, isn't it?
Yeah.
If you have these interests and passions, which you clearly do, it's difficult to reconcile those things with that, isn't it? Really?
Yeah. So
has your approach to travel changed? Because you just did the trip to, the island trip. That's like a local thing, isn't it? Is it more about that now? Like those?
Yeah,
those where you can combine all these things.
Yeah, definitely. It's been quite a few years for me of really not wanting to go anywhere, get on a plane or do anything. I remember having some chats with Fergal Smith actually a few years ago, just on the email, when he was grounding himself in his area, and I felt much the same. But then, I've got a different situation where my partner's from America, and we go there to visit her family and stuff. So there are still sort of these family trips that we do that we then tack on a bit of surfing stuff too, so that it's just sort of perhaps one journey a year. But other than that, it's really, it's about having the good fortune of living in Australia, man. It's like as wave rich and as spacious as it gets. And I have very
Yeah.
I have very low standards for surf. Like, I'm really easily pleased. If it's not
That's good to hear.
if it's not crowded, if there's no crowd and the water's clean, I'm stoked. Like, I'm really stoked. And my partners, we're the same. And so it's just so easy to stay here, you know, like, just makes it really fulfilling to dive into the water in this area and know that it's clean, and to you know, just keep things simple. And that's just a result of having some great mentors, you know, like people like Albie Falzon, you know, the Morning of the Earth filmmaker, who is just probably the most stoked, grounded, and amazing elder surfer on the planet. I think he's just so radiant and just stoked. He's got that wild sparkle in his eye, you know, in his mid to late 70s, and he's surfing every day, and he's doing that because he's lived a very gentle, simple life. And so, you know, that's been just a fortunate thing for me, is to have people like that to look up to and learn from.
You've got quite a community around you, haven't you, there as well?
Yeah.
You know, for all you know, as all these elements that you describe, and whether it's the ocean, the activism, the lifestyle that you try to live. Yeah, I'm assuming from what I know, there's a lot of mentors and people you can look up to as well to learn.
Yeah, exactly. And so what we're playing around with at the moment is sort of rehabilitating a portion of the land that we're on, because it was logged twice and then just had cattle running on it for decades. Is pretty beat up, and so there's an amazing man, Jeff Lawton, who's a permaculture sort of teacher and wizard, which is an amazing philosophy and approach to growing food and basically mimicking wild ecology on the planet. And so anyway, we are planting out and turning the soil in this one part of our property into like a real sort of habitat sanctuary, and also a real food bowl for our place. And because we have a few friends living with us on our property, and then the neighboring properties all have young kids, and we're all, you know, coming together and having these little working bees in the soil, and then cooking up food for each other. And there is that sense of culture happening. And just today I was talking with him, and he was mentioning, you know, look at the word agriculture. You know, it's got the word culture in it. It's you have a culture of people working and cultivating, of course, the land, but there's a culture that forms. And so it's just so good, man. It fits so perfectly with surfing. It's like you go and surf in the morning and then work the land all afternoon or something, you know, and just do your best to try and resurrect a place that's been beat up for so long, and get some food out of it at the same time. I just couldn't imagine anything better for my time. It's really, really fulfilling.
Yeah, it sounds it. On the surfing thing, in your last podcast, you mentioned you had a really interesting take on localism, I thought. Do you remember that little part of the conversation you and Lauren had? You were talking about the corona thing and the current crisis, and you were just really positive about localism. You kind of, it wasn't even localism, it was more about local surfers being connected to their community, like you're describing. And the localism was kind of mentioned, and you mentioned it as obviously like a pernicious thing, but you hoped it would lead to a positive outcome.
Yeah,
I thought it was a really interesting perspective, because that it kind of isn't from what we're seeing over here, tiny corner of the surfing universe. If anything, it seems to have brought out the most pernicious parts of that culture. So I just wondered where you were coming from with that.
Yeah, it's probably a bit naive, or a bit too hopeful, perhaps.
Well, I liked it. That's why I'm asking the question. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Well, I'd like to see. You know, it'd be amazing to see that sort of distorted idea of protecting a place that localism has, and our history of localism being that we try and keep other people away from a place that we cherish, mostly because we want access to that place without outsiders' interference or something, you know. So there's heaps of that here, and there still is going on right now. But the idea that it's just this tiny shift to the left that could turn that into a type of coastal custodial sort of role, where, you know, you have this obvious love and respect for a location if you're a local at a spot. You have this amazing sort of bedrock of understanding of that place, because you go there every day. If you're a true local, you know, you're surfing that joint every day. You're there no matter if it's 10 foot or 2 foot or whatever, you know. So a cool thing about that is perhaps you're the perfect person to speak at a council meeting or a thing where someone wants to develop the area, because you do go down there and sit on the point every day, and you see the whale migration, or you see the marine debris that washes up every south swell, or you see the sewage that comes out when all the rivers are in flood. You know, there is real value in that type of firsthand knowledge of a location. And so that's really what I'm trying to get at when I say that I feel like localism could be just shifted left a little, where it becomes something that is instead of being all about you protecting a place and a resource for your enjoyment, it becomes you protecting and, you know, defending a place from the true threats to that ecology, the true threats to that way of life. So anyway, that's just something that you see little bits and pieces of all around the coast in Australia, among the kind of, you know, very self-centered type of localism that we traditionally see. So I would hope that we could popularize that other type and you know, reorient some of that energy in a more selfless way. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, it's a powerful force, but it is almost 100% toxic, isn't it?
Yeah.
So,
yeah.
And you know, obviously, it's not the place to talk about localism in that sense. You know, we all know what it is. But yeah, I just thought it was really interesting because it's a perspective I've not really heard before.
Yeah.
Which I think is a nice reimagining of it, really.
Yeah, well, it really, for us, like, we have an amazing friend who's just such a master in the localization movement over the decades, Helena Norberg Hodge, and she just speaks.
Yeah, I really like the podcast.
Yeah,
it's great.
She's amazing. Yeah, so you've heard her point of view, and you know that it's localizing is something that brings solutions to more and more of the things that we're having trouble with. And so that's why I was like, oh, well, why don't we apply that to surfing? Okay, what does that look like? Well, obviously, just the words are so similar, and maybe there is a way we can localize things in the surfing world in a healthy way. And so, like, when we look at this area, for example, right now, you know, a way that we can be, you know, vibrant and strong and really thriving in this area is by localizing our food, localizing our economy, localizing our energy through things like solar power and those that we have at our disposal here, where instead of it coming from another state in the country or coming from another country altogether, we have these systems that are localized and really strong and create all these great relationships in the area. And the thing is, it's not just it's not theory in this area. We see it happening. People are trying all these ideas out and giving them a shot. And you see, oh wow, that little community in the hills, they've been doing that one type of food growing and living together as a community for a few decades, and they're all stoked, man. They got the coolest, like, they got just the nicest sort of aura around them. They all seem so happy and quirky and, you know, they're not moving hectic and fast like, you know, people in fractured urban areas are. And so it just really piques your curiosity when you live in an area like this where people are willing to say something and then try it and see where it goes. You know, it's neat. It's really neat.
Okay, so I've got one more question for you, which is, has your perspective on surfing shifted in a similar way to the general shift that we've been discussing?
Well, I don't know. Surfing's a funny thing. It's for me, it's always been actually a very personal thing, which is weird because there's, you know, I've had cameras around me and it's been something that's been in, I guess, magazines and websites and stuff like that, but I don't really participate in that world. Like, I don't have social media. I didn't have a phone for a very long time, and I just don't really exist in that world much. And so it's always just sort of felt like my own little universe, the surfing experience. And even when, you know, perhaps being in places like Hawaii on the North Shore where everything's heavily documented, everything that you do is, you know, documented in one way or another. I've always just sort of, I don't know, been in my own little world, and so now it's just easier to be in my own little world. You know, Patagonia is like the exact opposite of everything in the surfing industry. We try and do everything the opposite of every other group in that industry, and so really the only time that we would be, you know, shooting a picture of surfing or doing anything like that is if it's going to be meaningful or useful in some way. And so that's really refreshing and amazing to be able to have that approach to that side of things. But for me, you know, I pretty much surf alone every day. We live on a stretch of coast where there's some space, and I kind of just seek out my own little corners and surf alone mostly. And it's only when we have a very specific type of swell where everyone pretty much ends up at the same couple of spots that I'll surf in a crowd. But generally it's just my own thing, and it's just very personal. And even then when I'm in crowds, I generally will paddle off on my own somewhere or sit somewhere different. And that's just kind of how it's always been. It's just that what's around me now is different and just less. There's just less stuff around for all of that to happen. But actually, more than ever, surfing is so meaningful and fits into this life, which is, you know, growing food and working on these projects like Fight for the Bite and doing all that stuff and raising a family. But it's just, I feel like I've got more fizz for surfing now than I ever have, which is really comforting and just great, and just very fortunate, just so lucky, man. It's just like, you know, even now, like with this whole situation, there's friends that we've spoken to in other parts of the world who haven't been able to surf for months, and here we are doing what we normally do here. So we're very fortunate to be where we are.
Have you got a phone now?
I do. I've gone through.
How are you finding that?
I've gone through. Well, with a 2-year-old, it's a really good thing, actually. It's really good.
It's really handy. Yeah.
Yeah. It would really kicked in when a grommet came along. That's just like, okay, yeah, it's really, it's probably quite selfish to not have one, and it's good to know how he is if I'm not around, and vice versa. But that said, I'm really notoriously shit at using it. And my birthday party recently, when I had pretty much everyone in my world together with me, the very first thing I said to everyone was an apology, a deep apology on how shit I am with being communicative with that device. So hopefully I can do better.
Yeah, small steps.
Yeah.
Well, if I'll know it's changed if I see you on Instagram. Let's put it that way.
Yeah, definitely. That would be a big, big change. We know the world's definitely tweaking out if that happens.
Yeah. Hey, Dave, thanks, man. That was great. Really enjoyed it.
Yeah, likewise, and keep it up, man. It's great to just hear the different stories in our culture, and we both feel like it's really important, and it's just good. So good on you for taking the time to do that, and yeah, likewise, keep it up.
So there you go. That was me in conversation with Dave Rastovich, and I hope you enjoyed it. I highly, highly recommend Dave and Lauren's podcast, Water People, which covers similar territory in typically sensitive and thought-provoking fashion. Get on it. And thanks again, Dave, for coming on the show. As you probably know, I release new episodes of Type 2 every month or so, and they appear in my usual Looking Sideways feed, which you can subscribe to via Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or your usual podcast purveyor. If it's your first time checking it out, have a look at the back catalogue. If you head over to my website, www.wearelooking.sideways.com, you'll find over 100 episodes of interviews with some of the biggest names in action sports and other related endeavours. And also, if you enjoyed Type 2, consider following me on Instagram over at We Look Sideways, because I have been doing Type 2 live on Instagram every few weeks. They've got monthly now, and they're working out really well. It's a live interview with a guest discussing the things that we raise in the interview, and also just seeing how they're getting on. I've spoken to Belinda Baggs, Hugo Taghorn from Surfers Against Sewage, Chris Hines. There's been a few of them, and they've been great. Got a good audience building up on there. So We Look Sideways on Instagram, or Patagonia Europe on Instagram if you want to check those out every few Fridays. All right, that's it. Thanks for listening. I'll see you next time. Nice one.